fleet gathers for the occupation of Japan. Tokyo announcing surrender, Allied Commander General MacArthur has ordered airborne and seaborne landings. American warships are on their way to Tokyo.
There was nothing but total devastation. The only thing that remained were the eerie remnants of vaults and chimneys. But as far as you could see on all sides, there was just nothing left. It was really a horrible sight. The question was where you began.
To accentuate the positive feeling, minus the negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with Mr. In-Between.
After a long, brutal war, Americans came to Japan with a mission: to dismantle the system that had sent Japan to war and create another, based on an American vision of democracy.
We had no doubt the most dynamic economy in the world. We had a society where human rights and freedom of expression and opportunities for political participation were unparalleled. We had a great deal of self-confidence. We felt that we had a repository of knowledge and experience about democratic government that would be useful in other societies as well. And may I say, so did many Japanese.
When the Americans came, I was so surprised how big they were. I used to hang out with the GIs and I would ask them, "Hey, what's your name? Where do you come from?" Many people wondered what kind of trouble there would be when the Americans came, but there really wasn't any. I think most Japanese felt they were being liberated.
The occupation idea was to remold the Japanese, recast them in our mold, remake Japan. We're going to create a new democracy.
Are problems in the brain inside of the Japanese head. There are 70 million of these in Japan. Physically no different than any other brains in the world. Actually all made of exactly the same stuff as ours. These brains, like our brains, can do good things or bad things, all depending on the kind of ideas that are put inside. We're here to make it clear to the Japanese that their time has now come to make sense. Modern, civilized sense. That is our job in Japan.
Such an ambitious mission demanded an ambitious leader, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was anointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. The abbreviation, SCAP, came to be the name of the entire occupation command.
He wanted the occupation to be a success and to be a monument to his memory. The Japanese adore MacArthur. He wrapped himself in more clouds of mystery than even the emperor, and that is just the way they want it.
MacArthur was like a force of nature. He was like the river that flows or the wind that blows. Very few people thought of MacArthur as the enemy. It was just as if a new emperor had arrived.
The new emperor was charged with the task of remaking the image of the old emperor. During the war, Hirohito was a symbol of national unity. Now, many wanted to try him as a war criminal.
MacArthur was very old-fashioned. He believed in royalty. He regarded himself as royalty. And every time Dean Acheson or someone in Washington would say, hang Hirohito, he would say, blood will flow in the streets, we're not going to touch that man.
MacArthur believed that the emperor held a special power over his people. If he was a god to the Japanese, then he could work miracles for the occupation.
Finally, in the third week of September, word came circuitously. The emperor would like to come and pay his respects. Would that be all right? And MacArthur said, well, about time he recognizes I'm here. The emperor arrived promptly. I saluted very smartly, and I took the emperor's hat, said, Heiko Boshi, and he looked quite startled. He didn't want me to take his hat, but once I had started the motion, I did. As I led the emperor to MacArthur, MacArthur strode toward them to make it very clear that they were meeting as equals. No one was standing still and the other coming to them. And he said, you're very, very welcome, sir. And it was the lowest I had ever seen any Japanese bow. He bowed all the way down, so that the handshake was over the emperor's head. And then MacArthur simply took the interpreter and the emperor into the large drawing room. But first they posed for a picture. And in the first picture, the general blinked. In the second picture, the emperor had his mouth open and started to walk away. And then the third picture was the one that you normally see, because the one with the general blinking can't be printed in America, the one with the emperor's mouth can't be printed in Japan, so there's only the one.
For many, the photograph symbolized the new relationship between the Americans and the Japanese, and the new roles of MacArthur and the emperor. The first broadcast of the emperor's voice had ended the war. Then he renounced his divinity. Now he tried to soothe the fears of famine among his people, but they were skeptical of the power of their former god.
When the war ended, I was in China, in Shanghai. I was a prisoner of war. I returned to Japan in 1946. When I arrived, there was widespread unemployment. Inflation was severe, and there wasn't enough to eat. My own house had been burned to the ground.
6 million civilians and soldiers returned to a country that could not support them. In the cities, the Japanese lived in rubble. In the countryside, bad harvests cut the food supply in half. There were 13 million unemployed. Food was rationed, but newspapers carried reports of death by starvation.
In 1945 and 1946, there were still people living in piles of rubble. The contrast between what Americans had and what the Japanese had was so startling that the natural assumption would be that they had done everything wrong and that we had the secret of success.
Yes, folks, this is Army life in Tokyo. One phase of it anyhow. Roof garden, Japanese dancing girls, and everything. Not bad, what? Excuse it, please. Joe's seen better. A Jap jazz band, too, for Joe and Mrs. Joe. And the Ernie Pyle Canteen looks just like home. When you put it to music, this job of occupation in Nippon could be worse.
Japanese are a rather pragmatic people, and their system had failed them completely. And any number of times, walking along the Ginza, young people would come up and ask me, what is democracy? Just tell me what is democracy so that we can adopt democracy, and in that way Japan can recover and become a great and respected country once again.
長い間お世話になりました。その懐かしい福島の山々は皆さんの温かいお心は今でも忘れることはできません。僕たちは次の日本を建設するために陣を届けてやりのく覚悟です。ではさようなら。
軍国主義の時代、戦争、戦争。
War, fight, fight. That's all we'd been hearing for years. Then after the defeat, suddenly, everything was democracy.
Jazz was the sound of democracy. Trumpets and saxophones echoed through the ruins of Tokyo as the Japanese rebuilt the city. While Japanese tried to learn American ways, Americans tried to democratize Japanese culture. On national radio, SCAP installed a new show called Amateur Hour, which looked for new talent among the people. Baseball was discouraged during the war as a symbol of the enemy. The occupation released the pent-up enthusiasm for the grand old game. Japan's favorite pastime during the occupation was the movies. During the war, Japanese movies were made for the good of the Japanese nation and her allies. Mothers smiled as they sent their sons off to war. Powerful censors banned any books or films that damaged the empire.
I could not stand the Japanese censors, and I was glad that the Americans fired them immediately.
Americans installed new censors. They promoted the very things the old censors had banned. SCAP imported American movies to teach democracy to the Japanese, and Japanese poured into movie theaters to watch them.
Put the blame on Maine, boy. Put the blame on Maine.
Hollywood films seduced Japanese viewers, tired of sacrifice and ready for more personal freedom. Before the war, kissing on screen was banned.
Golly.
Now it was an order from the American censor. Lovers on screen must kiss.
I like that. I'd like more.
The occupation promoted free speech. Americans believed that big business and big government had suppressed the voices of the little people in Japanese society, from workers to women to intellectuals. Now SCAP encouraged them to speak out.
We were liberating the Japanese people from the subjugation that they had undoubtedly been subjected to. It was a police state, and people were glad to be liberated from that type of existence.
SCAP sought to root out all vestiges of wartime Japan.
There'll be no more Japanese war factories. No more Japanese war planes. There'll be no more Japanese warlords.
SCAP identified and tried Japan's war criminals. The most notorious and unrepentant was Hideki Tojo, the man who led Japan's war effort.
Accused Tojo Hideki, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, sentences you to death by hanging.
Many Japanese business leaders, considered partners of the military, were removed from their positions of power. This was the purge, the removal from office of over 200,000 military leaders, businessmen, and politicians.
Oh, it was a terrible experience to these people. I have my family purged and all that. Really, you were told not to go to office. How to make a living was a real question.
A great deal of dead wood was discarded as a result of the purge. And the purge was very popular with the next level of office holders and the next level of managers. In fact, it was so popular that at the time, I used to refer to it as early retirement.
Japan's war effort had been run by a powerful military-industrial complex. At its heart were the Zaibatsu, huge business conglomerates owned by a handful of families. When Japan had expanded its Asian empire, the army and the Zaibatsu worked together to exploit natural resources and cheap labor from Southeast Asia, Manchuria, and Korea. There were familiar names. Mitsubishi built the Zero fighter. Nissan built its first cars in Manchuria. To remake Japan, occupation reformers wanted to break up concentrations of power, to change Japan from a nation of big business to a country of little businesses. They would bust up the Zaibatsu and release their natural enemies, the communists. Japan's communists were one of the few groups who had consistently opposed Japanese militarism. When SCAP released them from jail, the communists renewed their attacks on military government and big business.
赤沢元帥の占領政策の性格が分かりませんでしたね。
I did not understand what MacArthur was thinking. Maybe he was looking for a poison to destroy the old Japanese system. One of the poisons available was communism. So like a poison, he released the communists into the Japanese system.
Japan's conservatives were appalled by the American reforms. They asked MacArthur if he was trying to turn Japan red, and they wondered what kind of people would foment such a revolution from above. The broad directives came from Washington, but it was from the Daiichi building in downtown Tokyo that a few hundred American men and women set about reinventing Japan. Few had any knowledge of the country they were trying to change.
My knowledge was zero. I had no knowledge other than what one would glean from a daily newspaper about Japan.
MacArthur was remarkably ignorant about Japan. There were only 60 Japanese he ever met, and none of them was lower in rank than a Supreme Court justice. I remember in the first election that Japan held under the occupation, I rushed in and said, Katayama has been elected. First Christian in Japanese history, first socialist in Japanese history. And MacArthur just looked up from his desk and said, does he speak English?
Many young reformers were ignorant of Japan, but they shared a faith in the American principles embodied by the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, using the power of government to promote social equality.
I think it was their mindset, an openness to change, not only an openness, but an impulse to promote change.
赤いリンゴに唇寄せて
With missionary zeal, the occupation reformers tried to translate the New Deal into Japanese. The occupation was as arrogant as it was idealistic, one country trying to remake the other in its image. The biggest changes in Japan were engineered by SCAP's government section. It was headed by MacArthur's friend General Whitney, a conservative Republican. But day to day, it was run by a more liberal man, Charles Cadies.
I was a thorough New Dealer, and I think we had people to the left of the New Deal.
Colonel Cadies was a man of tremendous talent, tremendous charm. I believe he was able to persuade General Whitney to go along with a number of reforms that Whitney might have been skeptical of because he was a profoundly conservative person.
MacArthur wanted to shake the foundations of the Japanese state. He ordered Japan's government to rewrite its 19th century constitution. When he didn't like the results, he turned the job over to General Whitney and the government section.
One day, General Whitney called us in and said, "You are now a constitutional assembly and will work on writing the Constitution because General MacArthur is not satisfied with the various drafts which have been presented to him."
We are to be operating in top secret, and that this draft Constitution would, when completed, be presented to the Japanese government so that they could present it to the Diet and to the people as the Japanese government's draft.
To do the job, MacArthur gave the government section 6 days.
Well, I never thought we could do it. Once I heard him say he wants it by the end of the week, I was thinking in terms of a month or 6 weeks.
This was the opportunity that many people would really give their right arms for, because here this small group of people were invested with the responsibility of drafting a constitution for one of the great nations of the world.
Here we were, a group of officers, although not a single one of us was a career officer, but still we were hardly comparable to the founding fathers who drafted our Constitution in the U.S., and we knew that.
There were 24 authors, among them a congressman, a novelist, a newspaperman, a doctor, 2 academics, and 5 lawyers. No one had any constitutional expertise.
I guess I was picked because I had a freshly minted PhD in politics from Princeton. And maybe because Chuck Cadies wanted another Cornell alumnus.
There were 8 civilians. The civilians were picked pretty much by random, except for one young woman by the name of Beata Sirota, who had lived in Japan, so she knew what it was to live in a police state. Consequently, she was assigned to the Civil Liberties Committee.
When we were given this task, I thought, my goodness, we have to have some prototypes. And I took a Jeep and a driver, and I drove from one university library to the other and gathered up as many constitutions as I could. Of course, I didn't want to gather up all the constitutions in one library because it might make the librarian suspicious. So I came back, I think, with maybe 10, 12 constitutions.
Richard Poole was born on Hirohito's birthday. He was chosen to write the new constitutional role of the emperor.
You can't help but ponder the role of a young ensign in drafting provisions that will govern the functions of the imperial throne and the emperor. Well, it is rather a large order to swallow. We didn't want him to be just window dressing. On the other hand, we didn't want to give him the powers that he had under the previous constitution. We finally arrived at the term that the emperor is the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people.
Memories of the war haunted the Constitution. Article 9 called on Japan to lay down its arms forever.
It's very difficult to require a country forever and a day to forswear armed forces, even in self-defense. So I raised a question, and Colonel Cadiz looked at me and said, "Poole, do you know where that draft comes from?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "The general." And he said, "Need I say anything more?" And I said, "No, sir."
MacArthur was concerned with his place in history. And wouldn't it be remarkable that a military man was able to induce a society like Japan to renounce armaments?
I therefore commend Japan's proposal for the renunciation of war to the thoughtful consideration of all of the peoples of the world.
It's worked out greatly to the advantage of the Japanese, because while we spend 6+% of our GNP for military purposes, they've held theirs to 1%.
The article on women's rights was written by Beata Sirota.
The idea that a woman couldn't decide whom she wanted to marry, the idea that she couldn't divorce a man, that she really had no rights as far as property was concerned, was very disturbing to me. And so I wrote in many very specific rights, such as even prenatal care and maternity leave and all kinds of things of that type, which appear in many other constitutions in the world, not in the American Constitution. But when we presented this to the steering committee, which was made up all of men, said that this went further than the American Constitution and was too specific.
The provisions went into great detail, almost like a Social Security law, and so we struck them out.
And I argued for quite some time, and I think I even cried a little bit.
She was very emotional about this. Here I am in uniform, with a 20 slip of a girl, really weeping.
And finally, the steering committee said, well, they would incorporate the main rights that I had written down.
Women's rights? Changing the role of the emperor? These radical changes never occurred to Japan's conservative government, including future Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida. Then Yoshida and the others saw the new American version.
The reaction of the Japanese was one of complete astonishment. They were dumbfounded. General Whitney passed 4 copies out to them so that they could read the draft, and said, now we know you want to read this and consider it, so my staff and I will go into the garden. When Shirasu came to bring us back, he said to Whitney, we're sorry we've kept you so long standing out here. And Whitney said, oh, think nothing of it. We've been enjoying your atomic sunshine. At which point, incidentally, a B-29 flew over the foreign minister's residence rather low. I thought it certainly had a persuasive element.
Japan's conservative government hated the new constitution, but they were in a bind because elections were coming up. And according to national polls, most Japanese firmly backed its principles. If the government continued to resist, SCAP threatened to put the American draft before the Japanese people. The government gave in and presented the Constitution as a Japanese draft. Few people were fooled. Newspapers said, "It smells of butter." meaning distinctly American.
MacArthur's occupation came in and imposed a constitution on Japan. But we didn't do it ourselves. True freedom, true democracy must come from within. I agree with many of the ideas, but the process was wrong. We should have done it ourselves.
All during the summer of 1946, the National Assembly debated and fought over the Constitution. Among its strongest supporters were 39 female representatives, newly elected when women voted for the first time in Japanese history. Strong popular support and the backing of the emperor secured passage of the new document. Finally, on November 3, 1946, the emperor officially proclaimed the adoption of the new constitution. It has never been amended, despite its foreign origins.
It was an American document, and every Japanese at that time knew it, and they know it today. So why has such a foreign imposition survived? The democratic ideas were not something that we brought to Japan. These democratic ideas were there. Many people paid very heavily for espousing them. The writers, the teachers, the artists, the labor unions, the women. There has been, I think, a tacit coalition among these groups to resist any basic change in that Constitution, which would have the effect of re-centralizing government or remilitarizing the society or limiting in any way the freedom of expression.